No, ma'am, are you speaking?
Yeah, hi Amaka, can you hear me now?
Hi, ma'am.
Yeah, Amaka, can you
Yes,
hear
I
me?
hear you.
Oh, okay. So I realized
Loud and clear.
probably I was not audible enough earlier. So okay,
Yes, I
so
can
we
hear
have
you.
22 people right now. All right, thank you. Okay, so let me go ahead and share my screen again as we are about to start. Okay, all right, good evening, guys. All right. Okay, so welcome back. Welcome back to today's session. Right, we are going to continue from where we stopped yesterday. I think we actually discussed functions, right? We discussed functions. We discussed control flow. Ideally, this session was meant to cover only control flow. So we'll be trying out some examples, right? When it comes to if statements, for loops, while loop, and all that. Okay, switch statement. We're going to try more examples on that, but I want us to first, go through some other details when it comes to functions, right? Yesterday we covered the most basic, type of function, right? Creating basic functions. We have arrow functions, we have anonymous functions, and all that. Although we were able to just give some description, we'll go over it again. And if you have questions, do well to drop your questions in the chat. Okay. So, yeah, good evening. That is from yeah, that's from what's that name? Eniago, okay. Oh, Eniaya Agu. Okay, sorry if I don't pronounce your name correctly. Okay, so let's continue from here. Looking at what we covered yesterday, function. By the way, remember we have this repository on. I think this was shared with you on WhatsApp. For those of you that are probably not on the WhatsApp group, let's see. Gates remote show origin. So this is publicly available, right? You can clone this repository and you can always pull before every class because we have new additions to this repository before every JavaScript class. Okay. All right. So that link has been shared with you in the chat. You can check. For those of you on LinkedIn, I don't know if you would see this link. I can see that this link was shared on YouTube and Twitch, right? So maybe what you can do is head over to the Discord server. Okay, head over to the Discord server and you will probably just request for that link on the Discord server or the WhatsApp group. Okay, if you are not on the WhatsApp group, check out the Discord server. If you're on the Discord server and or if you're not on the Discord server even, I think you can actually access that by simply navigating on your web browser to topuniverse.org/discord. Okay, someone can please put that up on the screen somewhere, topuniverse.org/discord. Let's proceed. Yesterday, we actually saw how to work with a very basic function. We'll try the same thing again today. So here I am going to bring up an example, right? You have a function, maybe a function to add two numbers, right? Pretty, basic, okay? So we have function. You always start off with a function declaration there. We have add two numbers, okay? And I'm simply going to bring in a and b as the variable, right? Variable a and variable b. Okay, so we can simply return. So return is simply going to give us, we're simply going to return that particular, computation. right? It's going to respond to say, when I call this function, give me this as the output. Okay. You can as well go ahead and just say, console.log here, or you want to print this, or you want to perform some other kind of computation here. You want to save this to a DB or something, whatever it is you want to do. Using return is simply going to act as a response, from that particular function. Okay. So at this point, we can have something like let total equals add two numbers, and we can put some random values there. We have 10 and 20. So if I say console.log and I have total, this would print out the total of what we have in this function, right? Which is 10 and 20, giving us 30, of course, right? So that is going to give us 30. Okay, so if we go ahead and run this, let's navigate to the JavaScript folder there. Okay, so node main.js. So this is going to give us 30, as you can see right here. Okay, let's do that again so we don't have that error from my terminal. So we have 30. All right, yeah, good evening, Edwin, and hello, Phillips. Okay, so this is a very, straightforward function. The point here is we're trying to use this to understand, how to write a simple function. And now the question should be, why do you need a function like this? Why must it be a function? Why don't we just, go ahead and say let a equals 10? Let b um, let b equals 20. Why must we use a function, right? And I think the most basic response to that would be, you are building up, blocks of computation, right? In such a way that you can logically, reason about. Okay. So when we say add two functions, we're rest assured that calling this, we're going to pass in what we call the arguments or the parameters, which has to be two values here, right? A or B. Okay, so we can say, okay, we want three values. We can even say we have a different function that we're passing in before A and B. Maybe we want to use that function to do some other kind of thing, right? So we have a different function, for example, maybe check if it is even, right? So we are probably going to, maybe we want to pass in that function, right? So we want to probably pass in that function before perform. I mean, that is not really necessary in this example, but I'm just trying to give, an example here. So we can actually have a function return a function. We can have a function call another function, right? But yeah, I mean, that is something you could do. Okay, we're going to explore more types of functions here. But yeah, we're basically grouping this into logical blocks, right? That performs a specific, action, right? So a function can be said to be a unit of computation. Okay, let us proceed. Let's go into this file here. So we have more on functions. All right, so we've tried out the basic function definition and invocation. All right, and yeah, we've also tried out how to use the return statement here. Okay, so we have functions with multiple parameters. That's simply what we've tried out already, right? Adding two numbers. This is basically multiplying three numbers. Okay, and you can also have a function without a parameter. So it is not compulsory to use a parameter. All right, Adewumi said, this is my first time here. I'll be playing catch up. Yeah, we have other videos you can go back. You can spend some time watching those videos so you can catch up. Okay. So we have functions with a default parameter. I mentioned this yesterday. Let's try this out as well. So the point of using a default parameter, I mean, this of course depends on what you're trying to achieve, but we are putting a default parameter to say if the user does not pass a parameter, we want to work with the default value. So what you are seeing here, when we try to run this, if the user does not pass in a name, we're going to work with guests, right? If the user passes in a name, then of course that name would replace guest. Correct. So let's try that. So we have a name here, Bob. Okay, so if I run this, we get hello Bob. If I run this without the name, then of course we get, let's run this properly. Okay, node main. So now you see hello guest. So we'll work with the guest value, which was the default, right? Sometimes you might have some kind of mathematical calculation, right? And you probably want to, let's say, function area of a circle, right? Area of a circle. Now, of course, on no account will you say the value of pi has changed, right? So you're not going to say the value of pi has changed. You're expecting radius, and pi can have a default here of 3.142. And this is a silly example saying you might want to change the value of pi, right? By default, this should be a constant. Okay, so by default, this should be a constant. I mean, looking at the formula, right? This should be a constant. But the point is, you have a default. So if you are working on some kind of, math or something, or let's just say you're working on some kind of logic, and you say, okay, if in case we don't have uh, the value passed, we actually have a default we can work with, right? That is a good use case of, applying that, default value in your parameter. Okay. All right, so let's move on to the next thing here. So this is a function with local variables. Okay, so you can actually have local variables, of course, within your function. This is the example we have here. All right, so let x equals 5, let y equals 3, and then we have let result equals x plus y. So yeah, this is pretty much having to declare local variables within that function. Okay, so yeah. All right, so you have the result of 15 from this. Let's move on to the next thing here. So yeah, you have a function with a global variable, just like when I mentioned, uh, probably setting up pi as a constant, right? So it means whenever you are trying to use that value in here, it is going to reference the global variable you've set, which means you can then share the global variable across multiple functions. All right, so for some reasons you have multiple functions. Let's try that out. So we have let's just say we have global value as 10, right? So let's say we have a global value as 10, and we have two functions. The first one is addition, for example, and the point is to always add two numbers, right? So let's say a and b. In this our example, we have function subtraction. Okay, so we also have a and b, and we simply want to return a minus b. All right, so probably we want to first say let results equals a minus b, and you also want to say return our global value, right? Plus result or minus result. Okay, in this case, so we have minus result, and right here we also have let result equals a plus b. We're doing addition, correct? So a plus b plus b. Okay, and we have return. Okay, so global value plus result. All right, so now we're not calling this function, but if we go ahead to call this function, so we have addition. Let's console.log addition, and we're going to pass in two values here, maybe 2 and 1, right? So we can repeat the same thing for the subtraction. Okay, so yeah, we are basically calling the function within console.log. You can have this outside, right? So let's have addition result. Okay, so you can actually have that outside, subtraction results. Okay, and right here you can simply say console.log addition results. Not that. Right, you can have the same thing here, subtraction result. Okay, so now you have a function. Basically, you have those two functions working with the global value, right? So when you have global function, you are referencing this, which is of course 10. Okay, so if you run this, you get 13 and you get 9 based on the values you passed in, by the way. So this is how you work with a global value when working with functions. All right. Okay, so we have the function expression. So basically what you're seeing here is we're passing in a function within a variable, of course, as a constant here. So you can simply use that variable, which is subtract, as the function. What you are doing here is you're declaring a function expression. And yeah, let's go ahead and try this out. Let's copy this, Control C. Simply going to take this off for now. Let's paste this in here. All right. So we have the function, we have the constant subtract, okay, and this constant then holds a function, right? So if I hover on the on subtract, you see you can actually see the function shape here, right? And this basically is going to return the subtraction. By the time you say a minus b, you return the value. Okay, so now we have const difference, which is a different constant. We're invoking this function here by simply calling the subtract variable, which of course holds a function, right? And then we pass in the parameters we have in here. So when we say console.log the difference, it is going to then return, the value, right, based on the subtraction of, the subtraction of b from a, which is 8 from 3. So 3 from 8, I mean. So if we go ahead and run this, we have difference is 5. All right. So let me take a look at the chart. If you have questions, drop your questions in the chat. Okay. All right. So let's proceed. All right, so back to this file, more on functions. We have the arrow function. All right, we have the arrow function. So when we are working with JavaScript for web development, we'll get to see the difference. When we work with arrow functions and the regular functions, it will be better when we describe it by that time, so that you'll get a more practical understanding of probably when to use it. Okay. So we have arrow function. This is quite a simple example. You just have a single line of definition here. If you have worked with maybe Python and you see things like lambda, right? Of course, this does not really look like a lambda if you're using Python. But the point is, you can simply have a single line declaration of your function that actually performs a particular kind of action, right? So this is going to return whatever comes up here as the output. Okay, this is using an arrow function. We just have a single declaration, so JavaScript is smart enough to understand that this is going to give you a return value. Okay, so of course this is equivalent to you basically returning something, but yeah, we're not doing that here, so because it's a single line. And yes, you can actually use it this way, right? You see, you have const squared value equals square 4. Square 4 here, 4 meaning the number, right? So 4 is the parameter you pass in here. Whatever you have here becomes the parameter of square, which is the function. So if you have num, maybe num1 and num2, it means you can pass in 4 and 5, for example. Okay, so you see we have num1 and num2, correct? And right here you can then work with num1 and num2. So this is going to return. Okay, so this is going to return. So by the time we say const squared value, let's just say result, because we have changed the meaning, right? So let's just say results. Okay, let's call this arrow func. All right, so results, let's print out the result. Okay, so what we are doing there is so we have 1024 because we are saying 4 times 4 times basically exponential, right? Okay, so let's see the chat. If you have any questions, I'll give you 2 minutes or 1 minute. I think that should be enough. Drop your questions in the chat before we proceed. Okay, we've covered a couple of things now. I believe you probably have some questions. I have 36 of you here. Drop your questions in the chat, guys. All right. Okay. So I can see we don't actually have any questions for now. Let's proceed with some other examples. Let's give 1 or 2 examples of arrow functions before we move on to the next. All right. So this was a one-liner. Let's take this off, and now we are going to apply the arrow function pattern to the previous example we did, which was having a function to add 2 numbers. Okay. So let's say we have add. Right. This is going to be a function. So we're going to say function, and we expect A and B. Now, this is what we did before, if you remember, right? So this is basically having a function declaration, right? So we can have return A plus B, correct? Okay. Now, if we want to, make this an arrow function, of course, what we are going to do would be to say, let's call this add arrow, right? Add arrow, so that we can have a difference with the name of the function. So you see, I already have, I already have what it should look like. This is what it looks like here, right? Working with an arrow function. So we can simply, of course, we can simply return a plus b here as well. And yeah, we've been able to use an arrow function, to define, this function that adds two numbers. Okay. All right. So let me see what we have. How does an arrow function know the value to be returned? Okay, how does an arrow function know the value to be returned? Now, my assumption is that this your question was based on the example I gave, which is, let's try that again. Let's comment on this for now. So I believe, come on, comment on this, add arrow. Okay, and you are referring to having something. Oh, I almost got that. Okay, so you are referring to having something like this, correct? Well, so this is a JavaScript pattern. Now it's a short form. JavaScript, of course, understands that this should be returned, right? This is built into the language basically. All right, it's not something we are doing from our end. Having your code written like this, JavaScript understands this pattern. Just like when you write a regular if statement, and then you also use the short form, by using remember using this operator that we tried out the other day. So it's a JavaScript thing. Okay. Okay. I hope that answers your question though. All right. Okay, so I'm actually waiting to see if you have more questions. I think that was from the Mystical Coder. If you have more questions, please go ahead and drop your questions in the chat. Okay. All right. Let's see. What do we have here? One of the major things you would notice, right, working with arrow functions, and of course using the regular function, one of the major things you would notice is, okay, how do you actually, what's the point of actually having, this? Okay. Uh, Now the thing is, when working with arrow function, it doesn't really require the function, description there, right? This syntax function. Okay. So it is not required. It is not required. And also, if you have a single expression, just like I mentioned earlier with the other example, you see, we did not need to have that return statement. Okay, that is if you have a single expression, right? A single expression meaning that we have a single expression like this, just one line. Okay, if you have multiple lines, maybe you want to perform some additional computation, then obviously this will not work. Let's comment this out. So obviously this will not work. If you have more items here, this would not work as a single line. You can't actually do that. All right. So that is just something you should take note of. When working with, we're going to try that later. So there's something actually called this, context. Okay. Especially in your front end development, you would find a lot of scenarios where you're probably working with an arrow function, and this guy does not really give you context. So what we usually find ourselves doing is maybe some patterns where we have to say a different term, right? Maybe let self equals this, right? And then instead of using this here, you basically end up using self. Okay, and I would basically explain why we have to do things like this. If you have used some libraries as well, if you are experienced here, you should have seen that. But explaining that at this point might not be very clear. So when we start working with classes, and we also start working with maybe some advanced objects, and when we even get to applying JavaScript in, front-end development with Vue or React, you would get to see that pattern. Okay, so just take note of having your regular function as well as using the arrow function for now. Okay, just take note of that for now. All right, let's proceed. Let's go back to this file. So I think that is it for what we have in here. Okay, let's move on to anonymous functions. All right. Hopefully this works today. So let's see. Yeah, great. Okay, so we have all right, so we have anonymous functions here. And basically anonymous functions are functions that does not really have they don't really have like a definition, like a name, okay? So you can basically use, so we have an example like a map, right? When working with a map, you're basically using an anonymous function, right? You can actually have that function defined outside, okay? And then you basically call that function in here while passing that expression. But if you decide to write the function within the map, then yes, you can actually use an anonymous function this way. We'll get to talk about maps, right, in JavaScript. The fundamental idea of working with a map is simply a way to um, I would say it's simply a way for you to have like a shortened way, a shortened pattern, when trying to perform a computation across a list of items. You see, we have an array, right? This is what we call an iterable or iterable. Okay, so iterable, if you're seeing this, right, you're able to iterate over the list of items, right, within that array. Okay, so or within that list, I'm going to call this an array. That is what it is here. Okay, so we're able to iterate within that item in the array. So using the map function, we're able to get such functionality of going through each item in this array and performing this computation where we have to multiply each item by 2. Now, we'll get to talk about map in a more detailed session, but just to show you what is going on here, if I should run this, you see now we have 1, 4, 9, and 16. Okay, what is going on here is we're basically performing this exponential. Okay, we have numbers, which is the array, right? Dot map, which means we're trying to iterate over each item. Now, when we're trying to iterate over each item, of course, you have to pass in a function that will do that. Okay, so it's either you have a function outside of this, right? You probably have a function called a multiply or exponent, right? And that function is going to accept a value, and then you are simply going to return that value, that particular that particular value exponential 2, right? So you can actually pass in this here as the exponent. Okay, so you can pass in the number and the exponent, but we are not using an external function. So this is just because we're trying to show you an anonymous function. So this does not really have a name. It just does this job here, and that is all it's going to do. Okay, so by the time we run this, it's basically taking each number because we have applied the map. Okay, it's taking each number and is multiplying each number. It's basically squaring each number. Okay, so like 1 times 1, right? 2 times 2, 3 times 3, 4 times 4. Okay, that's what you're getting out of this. All right. So that is a simple example of working with an anonymous function. We have some other anonymous functions. We're applying this anonymous function right inside a button click. We're going to be doing this when we start applying JavaScript into front-end web development. You have a button, you add an event listener, right? So when I click on this button, I want to perform this function. Ideally, you can have this function written outside of the button, just like the example I shared with you earlier. But this is an application of anonymous functions in front-end development. Okay. So yeah, if you have not done this before, we are going to try this out when we start applying JavaScript in front-end web development. Okay, so we have a different example. This is also a front-end web development thing, working with set timeout function, right? So we have the anonymous function here that is basically going to display, this value after 2 seconds. Okay, it is going to display this value after 2 seconds. All right. So we also have anonymous function in array filtering. So this is also an advanced, method that we're applying here, right? Dot filter, just like the way we did dot map. This is basically applying a filter. It is going to print out only, or it's going to return only the numbers that are even numbers, right? So when we divide this by 2 and we are able to get 0, remember this is modulus. We actually mentioned this yesterday, all right, in our arithmetic operations. Okay, so what we are checking for here is to return the numbers that when divided by 2 gives us the value of exactly 0. This is the strict equals. Okay, so when we divide by 2 and we get 0, go ahead and return that number so it can be logged. So when you have a list of numbers, it is only going to pick the even numbers because of our check, right? So we are filtering for only the even numbers. Okay. We're not going to dive into this yet because we would have to discuss, map, filters, and reduce functions in a later session. Okay. Um, all right, so this is an anonymous function type that is used for immediate invocation. All right, so the point is you don't have to call this, right? It is called, the way you actually write it, you are invoking it already, right? This is invoking this already. Okay, so we have that function in here wrapped within the bracket. Okay, and then we'll also invoke the function immediately. So running this file it is going to invoke that function, right? You see, running the file invokes that function, and we did not have to call the function. The function has no name. Okay, so you can't actually call the function, it has no name. So this is how we invoke that function immediately. You will see this pattern applied in cases where you're trying to initialize something before executing your program, right? Before executing the other parts of your code. Maybe a database initialization, right? Maybe some functions that would check an API if something is valid or not before we continue with the application. Okay, so you can actually do some checks and you say, okay, if something is not valid, right? For example, go ahead and return or terminate this particular code. Okay, so you're going to see this kind of function applied in such cases, and of course, we are going to experiment with this as well. By the time we get to work with Node.js and Express, we'll definitely use something like this for managing some dependencies like database connection. Okay. All right. So that was an example. Another example of anonymous function. We have anonymous functions as callbacks, right? We have anonymous functions as callbacks. We'll get to talk about callbacks as well. But what you're seeing here is basically, that callback, which is what we have here, right? We are applying that callback in here, as you can see. Okay, and by the time you call that function, you then append your anonymous function, right? So your anonymous function can be different at multiple instances. So if you call this function on this particular value, and then you say what I want to do in this function is multiplication, I can have a different call that is performing addition. So just to clarify on this, if I put this within our main.js file, we performed an operation. This time around, we added a specific type of operation, which is multiplication. I can have this same function, call this again. This time I apply maybe 2 on 2, and I simply want to do addition. Correct? I can also add this again. And this time around, I simply want to do maybe a subtraction. Okay, subtraction. All right, so this gives us subtraction. All right, this gives us addition, and this gives us multiplication. Okay, so now we are applying that function as a callback, right? Which was what I also explained initially when I say you can basically pass in a function and use that function to perform some additional computation on the other variables. Okay, so this is how you do that. Remember, you can also create this separately, right? So you can have function addition, right? A and B. Okay, and we basically have that return statement here. All right, so within this scope here, you can basically pass in that specific addition. Okay, you can basically pass this in. All right, but yeah, I mean, the point is trying to explain how the callback works, so you already know how this other pattern works. Let's take that off. Okay, so now you see we're able to use a function, an anonymous function as a callback, right? Let's take that off, and I would quickly check the chat as well before I talk about the other examples, which we're going to even get to see in more details in other sessions. But I'll just mention this as well. This is what we call a promise, and I'll mention that after the next 1 minute break. So go ahead and ask your questions, guys. Let me wait for a minute before I take those questions in the chat. All right, so let's take a look at the chart right now. So we have can multiple lines of code be used in a short form function too? I think I explained that. I said no. So when you mean short form, you are referring to the example I gave where you have a single line of arrow function, right? So that is for that question was from Bolu. So no, you can't do that. Okay. Um, let's see. But if you mean having multiple lines of code within an arrow function, right? If you mean maybe having a function, right? Of course, you have the variables in here. Come on. So like A and B, and you have this guy, right? If you mean having multiple lines of code, so multiple, yeah, then yes, if that's what you mean, you can actually, do this, okay? But if you mean having like a single arrow where you basically return, something like A times B right here, or A plus B, if this is what you mean, then you can only have one line, okay? All right. So, Bolu, you also said, okay, first, the mystical coder said, which is best practice, a function declaration or expression, and why? Well, it actually depends on, like what you're trying to achieve. Basically, using a regular function is, perfect. Using an arrow function also works fine. You just need to understand, how it works. Using an arrow function is mostly cleaner, by the time you're trying to, look at your coding pattern or your coding style, okay? But either of them works fine, right? If you are using the short form, for example, it's probably because you have a simple thing to check, maybe like the example we did here, exponential multiplication, those kind of stuff, right? If you're using a function expression, probably because you want to, wrap that function into some sort of constant, so it cannot be, you cannot have like people create more patterns that are probably confusing or something, right? If you're using an arrow function, and you're working with, let's say, you're doing front end development, yes, there might be some sort of limitation when you try to assess the this object, as I mentioned earlier, the this context. But of course, there are ways around that. Okay. So I think you just have multiple patterns, and then it depends on you, the developer. What do you prefer? Okay, what do you prefer working with? Okay. All right. Yes, Timothy, if I am too fast, please remember you can slow down this video, or you can also come back to the video afterwards. We just have 1 hour per class, and I give you guys enough time to, drop your questions so I can take them. Okay. Bolo is saying, please explain callback function again. Okay, let's bring back the example. Bring back the example. Let us see. Control Z. Okay, so this is the example I had earlier. So we have function perform operation. We have a, b, which are the parameters, and we also have a callback as a parameter. Now the point is the callback here, it's going to serve as a function that is also performing an operation on the initial parameters that we added. Now this is based on the example we're working with. Okay, so we have console.log results, which is going to print the result, and that result is based on whatever the callback function is going to be doing. So now we have an invocation. We invoke this function, we apply 2 and 2 as the value of A and B. And now for the function, which is the callback, we simply have the function right here, an anonymous function with the values of X and Y, which of course is to say we are passing in these guys in here by the time we make that call. As you can see, this is the point where we call that particular callback function, right? So this callback function represents this function we have here. Remember, 3 parameters: A, B, and callback. A, B, and callback. Okay. Now that callback is wrapping A and B, which means based on our usage, we also need to have 2 values here, right? And our return statement is acting upon the 2 values. Now, what are the 2 values? 2 and 2, because of course that is A and B. Correct? So when we have those 2 values coming here, we basically perform the computation, which in our context here is addition. So we return this, meaning 2 and 2 would be used for addition. At this point, we have a different example, as you can see, okay? And this says x minus y, which is subtraction, right? It's also a callback, and this gives us that flexibility to create a function definition here, and then apply multiple functions into the invocation. Do you understand? Okay. So someone said, how frequent is callback used? Seems not really necessary. Well, it depends. Now, what we have achieved with this, callback is that we don't need to specifically have a function doing this all the time, right? We just use it for this specific use case. Okay. We also use this for another specific use case. If you have a situation where this is something you are trying to achieve without necessarily having a function defined in your code, because you don't have plans to reuse that in different files, then you can actually apply a callback. Most times you would find yourself using callbacks, probably because the library you are working with is using a call is implemented a callback within the methods, right? Or within the functions within that library. So you will find yourself using callbacks, most of the time when working with some libraries. And if you are also maybe you also make that decision to apply a callback, it's probably because you want to be able to apply multiple functions into the original function call, right? You want to be able to apply multiple functions. Now there are other patterns that can also do this, but this is an easy way to go about performing such action. Okay, so is the callback function same as recursion? Not exactly, right? The idea of recursion is that you have a function calling itself. Okay, we'll get to that shortly. You have a function calling itself. So if you have perform operation within itself like this, then yes, this is a recursive function. Of course, you should have a way to terminate this, else it will basically run forever, but we'll get to that. So this is not recursion. All right. Let me see. Do we have any other questions? AK Timothy, do you have any questions? If you do, drop it in the chat. Okay. Okay. So we have another example here, which is working with a promise. I mentioned that we are going to look into the definition and the function of working with promises, right? In JavaScript, working with a promise is a way. Okay, so we have a question there that says, does the callback work on the values returned by the original function, or it uses the initial values? It actually depends. So when you say returned, as you can see, there was nothing returned here, right? We're just, I mean, in this example, we're just, using console.log. We did not return. So the callback here is basically acting upon what you have, what you pass in. You have to pass it in basically, right? So yes, we have A and B here. You have to pass it in. If you have used A and B for some other kind of computation, right? So let's say we have used A and B or something, and then we probably, let's say we do something like let's C equals A plus B, and now we decide to pass in C and 5, right? Now that is a different use case, okay? Do you understand? So the point is you have to pass in the variables based on your definition, correct? But it doesn't really mean you must pass in the exact thing. So you can actually perform some additional computation before passing that in, right? It is flexible enough for you to use based on your specific, use case. Do you understand me? That is for Obasi. I hope you understood that explanation. Okay, does the callback work on the values returned? I think that is same question. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and move on to this. So I was explaining now, and I said when working with a promise, the point is, you're basically trying to check against an asynchronous operation, right? Asynchronous, and by the way, when we get to Node.js, we'll explain that in detail as well. Asynchronous, meaning that we are expecting a result, right? And that result is going to be based off, what we have here, the parameters we have here. Do we actually resolve this, or are we rejecting this, right? So if there's a success in this code, we say, oh, we want to resolve this, right? If it's rejected, oh, we want to reject this. So, okay, so promise rejected, promise resolved. Now, the thing is, this particular feature, I would say this represents what we call eventual completion, right? So, or eventual failure. Okay, so it's asynchronous, which means it's not necessarily needed to say this is running synchronously. It might not run immediately. You might use this to make some API calls somewhere, right? So your JavaScript execution can be doing other things, but it will eventually come back here, to resolve, to tell you that, okay, this was resolved or this was rejected, okay, based on your computation. All right. So this is how you declare or create a new promise. We'll dive into the details of promises when we work with Node.js, so you can actually see the practicality. For now, the point is we're just trying to show how you can apply an anonymous function, right, into a JavaScript promise, right? When we dive into promise in details, you would actually see how this works. All right. Yeah. Okay. So that is it. Let us let's see. Okay. So I think the last thing we need to quickly. Okay. So this is an example. By the way, I think I can preview this as well. This is an example of. Let's see. Close. Preview. All right. So I think we actually ran into that bug again from yesterday. Okay. All right, that's fine. Let's just look at that from here. So this is an example of, a recursive function, right? We have a factorial. Okay, so of course, if you know what a factorial is, you basically have a function that accepts a specific, value, and you're just performing some sequence of multiplications, right, from the value you have down to the base value. So if you have factorial of 5, you're basically saying 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1. Okay, so on every single call of that function, we are first checking to make sure to check. Well, first trying to check if we are actually at 1, right, or less than 1. Okay, so if we're at 1, then we stop, we return 1. Returning 1 is to say we are stopping that execution. If you don't have this, this function is going to run forever, right? And it's also going to get into the minus, the negative values. Okay, you don't want to do that. You want to have a condition that you are checking against, right? Except you actually want that function to run forever. Yeah. So what we are doing here is, by the time we perform that check, we move on to return the value, which is n, multiplied by the function itself, right? Minus the function itself with the value of n minus 1. Now this is a recursive case, of course, and what you are doing here is basically n times n minus 1, correct? So n times n minus 1. The function factorial is calling itself, so it's going to continue performing this negation, right, until it gets to that last value. Okay, so if you perform that log, if you pass in a specific value like 5, you get 20. Okay, yeah, so we also have another example here, which is a Fibonacci sequence, right? And yes, if you know this in mathematics, of course, you know how this works. You see, we also have the function calling itself again, right? So this is a recursive function. We also have that check, right? You should always have that check because you don't want this running forever. You want to have that check that tells the function that if n is less than or equals 1, return the value of n. Just stop there. So this is going to then terminate, the execution. Okay, but then if it's not at that point, then go ahead and return the function itself, which is, you're calling the function itself again. So it will continue to call the function and call the function until it sees that the value of n is now 1 and it returns n. Okay, so these are some examples, working with a countdown as well. A countdown is going to check the value, and until that countdown is at 0, it is continually going to call itself. Okay, so if you have 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, just like that, and it's basically performing that countdown until it gets to 0, then it tells you that the countdown is complete. All right, so if you're actually implementing a realistic countdown, you probably want to apply something like set interval, right? To make sure that you have that probably 1 second interval, while that countdown is being executed. Okay, all right. We also have a different examples, some of naturals. Now, you can actually clone this repository, go through these examples because there's so many of them here, and you'll probably, have fun experimenting with them, and, get a better understanding of how you work with recursions. Now, recursion in itself is a very broad topic, right? Because it's something you really need to experiment with, something you need to practice with before you actually get to understand, so many use cases and applications of recursive functions. Now, someone is asking, what happens if you don't terminate the recursive case? As I said earlier, you're going to have an infinite loop. It's going to call itself, call itself, call itself until you're out of memory. Okay, on your computer. All right. Please, what is the basic definition and purpose of functions generally? I think we mentioned that already. So we said a function is a unit of computation, right? So it's a logical way to group actions or computations into several blocks. Okay. So maybe you have a function that does something like fetching value from a database, right? So you have a function. call that fetch data from DB, right? And yeah, maybe you are passing in some kind of things here. I don't know, whatever it is. Okay. So you also, let's just say return null. Okay. So you also maybe have a function. Sorry, this should be closed. Okay. So you also maybe have a function that is doing something like, I don't know, let's say const fetch email from DB or check if email exists. Okay. Passing that email. All right, so you have something like this. Okay, so this is another function that can check if email exists. You see, I'm applying different types of function. It doesn't matter, it works. Okay, so that is basically the point. You are able to group different actions into its own block, and of course you can reuse them afterwards. All right. Let me see. Do we have any other question in the chats? I don't think so. All right, guys. Let's jump back into control flow. Let's just have like an overview, right, of control flow again. Unfortunately, I still can't present this guy. I don't know why. Let's see if I exit this. Okay, exit. Let's bring that back again. Probably need to I don't know, maybe I need to quit and open this up again. I don't think I want to do that. Okay, I don't think I want to do that. Now let's go back. Let's just look through right here. So this is an MD file, right? So I didn't want you guys to see all these all these special characters here used in making this file presentable. But yeah, there are other tools you can actually use to present this. I'll probably have to uninstall a couple of things from my maybe a couple of plugins. I believe there's something wrong with my VS Code instance. That is probably why I can't present this properly. Okay. So we have different ways to control the flow of execution within our code base, right? The first pattern here you can see is the if statements, right? We discussed this yesterday. If you were not in the class, go back to the video on YouTube and watch that. Okay, so we have the if statement. We're checking for a condition, of course, a Boolean condition here. We expect that result to be a Boolean, right? We can even have a function in here that will return true or false. Do you understand? So imagine trying to check. You have a program, you have a code that you have written, and what this should do is that you are expecting to get some sort of data from the user, right? Maybe via an API code. Okay, so you are expecting a user object. So let's just call that a user object. And of course, the user object would carry maybe like a name, right? Maybe you have a name of, let's say, John Doe and the departments. Okay, so let's just say we have name and department. All right, let's say computer unit. Okay, so this is a let's user object. All right, so this is what we have here. Next, you are actually trying to, okay, you're trying to check if a particular user exists in your database, right? So let's say we have an email of johndoe@email.com, right? So let's have a function that checks if a user, let's say user exists in DB, right? So we are expecting a true or false here, if a user exists in DB or not. One thing that you probably then have here is an email, right? You're going to pass in an email, and you're expecting to see true or false, right? True or false. Okay, so we have our database code, right? We can't do that now because we have not learned how to work with the database. So I'm just going to have some sort of comment saying database to check if, yeah, let's just say call DB to check if the user exists. Okay, so your select statement and all that, or you have a way of doing that check with some SQL Server or ORM or something. Okay, so we're going to simply return true, and this is just to say, oh yeah, we actually have that user actually exists. Or let's make this dynamic, right? So let's just have let's just call this a check. All right, so we'll pass in that check, which is going to be true or false. Now, while programming, I would always recommend learn to document, what you're doing with a comment. It can be a single line comment, it can be a double line comment, or multiple line comment. Sorry. So I would always recommend working with a multiple line comment, so I can say this is a simple function to check, right, if a user exists. Okay, in our database or not, right? Commenting is very important. Of course, we'll get to the point where I will teach you guys the, importance of, documentation, code documentation, right? It makes sense because when a different developer looks at your code, they can simply read the function and understand what you're trying to achieve. Now, it's good to also work with variable namings and function namings that make sense, right? Okay, so you see, this is just coming up. I have no idea what is wrong. So let's just go ahead and close this, right? I absolutely have no idea why this is happening. Okay, this is terrible. All right, and now for some weird reasons, I can't close it. I don't know. I'll have to check this again. Close. All right. Okay, come on. All right, so let's go back in here. Sorry about that. So it's a good idea to have a proper documentation so that developers can read and understand what you're doing. But while writing documentation like this with comments, it also makes sense that you are able to use good naming conventions, right? As well as probably within your function, if you have a particular operation and you want to add more clarity, then you can use a single line comment to add additional clarity, right? So call the DB, right? I can have it. Maybe I have a function that say calls DB, right? Or something else. It makes sense to actually do something like that. So now I have a return check. So return check is because I'm simply going to pass in true or false. Okay. So if we have a different function here, now you see this function will be used to do something like let's say respond to user. Okay, just to show respond to user. So we expect an email. Okay, so when this email comes in, we're going to call the user exists in DB function, right? So you see we have a function in here, and we're then calling a different function, which is the user exists in DB, right? So this in this function, we'll basically pass in the email that we expect, as well as the check, which can be true or false, right? So we're already returning true here. So at this point, we can have our conditional that says if, so let's say let condition, okay, let condition equals this. So we can say if condition, right, which means this is either true or false, right? We can simply say return user exists in DB, right? Else, um, return user not found, okay, something like this, okay. So if we're calling this, of course we have to say respond to user. So let's call this function that would then call the other function, correct? So let result equals respond to user. I'll pass in the email johndoe@email.com. Okay. So at this point, we don't really need to pass in the check. So when this guy calls the other function, when this function calls this other function, then the check will be applied, right? And right here, we said that check is true. Okay. So if we go ahead and console.log our results, so let's save that properly. Make sure you save properly. Let's run that file. So that is node main.js. So it is going to tell us, oh yeah, so we have an error. Let's figure out what the error is. Okay, so our error came from that object. We're supposed to actually have these guys wrapped like this. Yeah, so let's go ahead. We're not using that anyways. Let's run this again. Oh, we have a different error this time. What does it say? Let's see what the error looks like. By the way, we can take this off. We're not using it for now. So let's just work with what we're using for now. We're having some errors there. So now we have user exists in DB. Let's go ahead and change this to false. We're working with the condition now, remember. So let's save properly and run this again. User not found. So the point is we're able to see how we apply the conditions into checking, performing different, checks. Of course, we also grouped these items into different units of computation. This particular function checks if a user is in DB. So if you have a different function for doing something else, you can also apply this and reuse it again. Okay. So let's see. Can you map through an object and other cumbersome data just like an array? Yeah, of course you can. You can actually map through an object, right? In most scenarios, you would actually have an array of objects, correct? But if you actually want to map through an object, yes, you can map through an object. Okay. So we have object methods, right? So where you can actually, see different methods that can be applied to an object. All right. So yes, we'll get to that when we start working with front-end web development using JavaScript. Okay. So Chooks is saying, okay, thank you so much. I was actually thinking that JS is hard, but the way you are handling it makes it lovely and understandable. All right, thank you very much for that comment, Chooks. And I think that will be all for this session. Please, I would advise you guys to go through the control flow. We mentioned a couple of control flow yesterday. We have if else, we have the if else if, right? We taught this yesterday. The ternary operator, we have the switch case, right? We have the while loops, we have the do while loops, we have the for loops. We also have the break statement, that is basically going to exit a loop based on the condition you have, basically, okay? And we also have the continue statement that is going to skip a particular item based on the condition you have, of course, and then move on to a different set of the other set of the items you have in the loop. Okay, so we have the comma operator when you are actually defining a variable or a list of variables without having multiple lines. Okay, and yeah, so these are control flow statements in JavaScript. Do well to go through this material. In the next session, we'll dive into more concepts when it comes to working with JavaScript. Okay, we still have object-oriented programming. We still have advanced object patterns. Okay, so we will look at those in the next class, and you would get some assignments. You guys already have some assignments you're working on, right? Front end, HTML, CSS assignments. Please go ahead and finish up with those, so we can move on to a different set of assignment. Now, remember, we are resuming the workshops on Fridays. Okay, Zeddy will be handling you guys. Will be taking some of the courses, right? Zeddy can favor. So if you have any questions, you can always reach out to them. They are the moderators. We still have other moderators you can reach out to, right? If you have any issues, do well to drop those complaints on the WhatsApp group, on Discord server, and it will be handled promptly. Have a wonderful evening, guys. I'll see you in the next class. Bye.